Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. Welcome to part 2 of a mini-series covering one unique fact for every castle unique unit. Last time we looked at units starting with letters A through K, and this time we're going to finish off the list beginning with the letter L. Jumping right in, we'll start with the Leitis. This is actually a pretty straightforward unit without anything too exciting hidden below the surface. That said, one odd fact is that its spear is technically longer than a step lancer's, yet it doesn't have the same +1 range. Neither one here really seems all that well matched to their animation versus range if we're being totally honest and looking at them in isolation. Next up, for the Longboat, while they appear to fire a large volley of identical projectiles, it turns out only one of those projectiles is the main one, and the others just do 1 damage. That's not that strange within AoE2, but what is strange is that those extra projectiles then have +1 bonus damage against camels, but the camels still end up taking just 1 per shot. You may notice that's exactly the amount of damage they would do if they didn't have a bonus against camels to begin with, and they also have the same thing happening against ships, again usually changing nothing. Moving on to the Longbow, we all know they have very good range, but what you may not have realized is a fully upgraded elite Longbowman can outrange every castle in the game except for the Teutons with crenellations. Fully upgraded castles have 11 range, while elite longbows max out at 12. It's maybe a little strange that any number of longbow shots can take out a stone castle, but in all honesty, probably isn't even the weirdest example like that. Battering rams lighting farms on fire also comes to mind. Next up, for the Magyar Huszar, after Corvinian army removes their gold cost, they become a trash unit, with advantages and disadvantages compared to the regular Huszar line. Making that comparison even more explicit, the Magyar Huszar is considered a light cavalry unit for the purposes of the Hindustani team bonus, where they have extra bonus damage against buildings. Note that that's true both with and without Corvinian army research, and the Steppe Lancer and Shrivamsha Rider are also considered light cavalry for the Hindustani team bonus purposes, as it turns out. Moving on to the Mameluke, this is a unit that in at least 1v1s can be hard to justify on account of its very high gold cost. That said, despite that high cost, or actually maybe because of it, it's actually tied for having the cheapest elite upgrade at the castle in terms of total resources, at just 600 food and 500 gold. It's not a bad upgrade either, giving more HP, attack, bonus damage, melee armor, and cutting down on their attack delay when microing. Next up, for the Mangudai, as a bit of a historical point for this one, while in-game they appear to ride normal-sized horses, in reality, Mongol horses were famously very small, comparable to European ponies. Modern-day Mongolian horses, which outnumber people in Mongolia, are thought to be very similar to the horses used by Genghis Khan's army. Their small stature actually made them slower than European horses, even though AoE2's Mangudai are relatively fast for cavalry. If anything, they should maybe look closer to missionaries, riding something similar in size to a pony. Speaking of which, a fun fact about missionaries that's easy to forget or overlook is how much better they've quietly gotten since their release. I'd argue as one of the most improved units. Over the years, they've had their healing rate doubled to match the monk, gained 1 extra conversion range, and are now affected by bloodlines, husbandry, and fervor, giving them more HP and moving much faster. Despite that though, it's still not a unit you end up seeing very often. Moving on to the Monaspa, they're of course well known for their ability to increase their attack when close to other Monaspa or knights, but what you may not know is how close they have to be to get that effect. It turns out they're only affected by units within 15 tiles, with one of the knights here counting and the other one not. If you have the enhanced graphics pack, it's pretty much the full screen when zoomed out at 1080p resolution as an easy rule of thumb. Next up, for the Obuch, no doubt you know that as they attack enemy units, they strip 1 melee and pierce armor each time, including blacksmith upgrades, reducing enemy armor down to 0. One of the quirkier facts though is if a damaged unit is then healed back to full health, the Obuch's stripped armor is then immediately repaired just as the unit hits 100%. This also works if you garrison a unit to heal it back to full health, or if it's one of the units or heroes that can self-heal. Moving on to the organ gun, hopefully this is something you already know, but would be easy to miss, and is that as of a few months ago in a patch, they now have +2 bonus damage against skirmishers and infantry on every single one of their projectiles as part of an overhaul for that unit. Newer players always seem tempted to make skirmishers against them, maybe because skirmishers have bonus damage against several different gunpowder units, but in this case organ guns are actually a pretty potent anti-trash counter. Next up, for the Plumed Archer, a little quirk with this unit is they secretly have +1 bonus damage against infantry, growing to +2 when elite. Generally, this has a relatively small impact, but one case it's very important is against elite huskarls in Imperial Age, where they deal 2 instead of 1 damage per shot like arbalesters. They even attack a little faster than arbalesters, making them even better in that matchup. Moving on to the Wrath Chariot, as a general rule for all units, when they're converted by an enemy monk, they're usually frozen with their stats at that moment and unable to be upgraded. The Wrath's special ability makes it a major exception to this though, and swapping from melee to range mode or vice versa is functionally switching out the unit with a brand new one in the same location and orientation. This makes the game forget who the old one originally belonged to, and it'll update its stats to its new owner's techs and bonuses. That means it can benefit from Magyar's recurve bow, more armor from Tatars, or Mongols' faster firing cavalry archers, as a couple of examples. Next up, for the Rattan Archer, this one has the dubious distinction of having one of the most expensive elite upgrades at 1,750 resources, and certainly the most expensive foot archer upgrade. It doesn't even give that impressive of a stat increase, and is one of those upgrades that can be tough to afford, always making me second guess it personally. It's rough for a civ that's been bottom 5 in 1v1s basically since release, though you do save a bit in early Imperial Age with free conscription, helping make this feel slightly more affordable. Moving on next to the samurai, Japanese culture is always known for their high emphasis on honor, with the most dramatic example being ritual seppuku, if they brought shame on themselves or were at risk of being captured. The original death animation in Age of Kings had the samurai falling on his sword as one of their animations. However, this was removed in Definitive Edition, and now they just fall over like many other units. Next up is the Sergeant. Maybe the most disappointing fun fact about the unit is that converted sergeants can't build donjons. Besides it being odd how they inexplicably forget how to do it after switching sides, it's a bit of a ripoff, especially considering they're pretty hard to convert after First Crusade, which raises their conversion resistance. Then again, since the donjon replaces the tower line, perhaps there's technical reasons that's not possible, so maybe we can give it a pass. Moving on to the Shotel Warrior, despite the fanfare around how spammable Goth huskarls and Karambit warriors are, the elite Shotel Warrior is the fastest created unit in the game, which is pretty scary considering they also have just 2 less attack than a fully upgraded elite war elephant. It turns out with 7 Berber allies having researched Casbah, you can then create elite Shotels in under a second each. The basic training process in entirety seems to be, here's a couple of Shotels, go get 'em boys. Next up, for the Shrivamsha Rider, a fun fact I never tire of, except when I'm against it, is their dodge mechanic allows them to take no damage from a direct Mangudai line shot. They can't recharge fully for a second shot, but considering this is also the second fastest land unit in the game, one shot is really all your opponent is probably going to land before you're in their minimum range anyway. Moving on to the Slinger, this is easily thought of as the Inca's Castle Age weaker version of the hand cannoneer. What you may not have realized though is that because of its high accuracy and quick fire rate, it actually has higher DPS than a hand cannoneer against infantry that have less than 10 pierce armor. While it doesn't necessarily have the well-rounded attack to deal with heavy cavalry in the same way, against infantry even in Imperial Age without an elite upgrade, the unit is no joke. Next up, for the Tarkan, you probably know the unit itself is a bit of an anti-building specialist. What you may not have realized is exactly how incredible they are against especially walls and fortifications. Not only do they have plus 10 against all buildings, but add an extra plus 10 or plus 12 against defenses. They end up doing 20 extra attack to palisade walls and castles, with them plus 22 against stone walls, gates, and towers. To put that into context, a single elite Tarkan is dealing close to 1,000 damage per minute against many of these buildings, which is about 2/3 as much as a battering ram. This is the kind of thing that goes under the radar, but can really mess up someone's day on arena within seconds. Moving on to the Teutonic Knight, an odd fact about them is that a fully garrisoned Teuton capped ram moves faster than a Teutonic Knight with squires, even if that ram is full of Teutonic Knights themselves, which seems a little inexplicable how they can push it faster than they can walk. As a bonus fact, in Definitive Edition, there's a new-ish cheat code, Put on Your Capes, which turns all infantry into elite Teutonic Knights. Next up, for the Thirisadai, this is clearly an impressive looking ship, just in terms of size. Funny enough though, internally in the code, it has the same collision size as a galleon or even a galley. Despite appearing almost 3 tiles wide, the game is perfectly happy to let it move through gaps that are just 1 tile. Now that said, in other contexts, the game clearly knows the Thirisadai is a large ship, and when set in formation for example, spaces them out much more than a group of galleys, revealing formation spacing is not based on units' individual collision size. Moving on to the throwing axeman, probably the most useless obscure fact on this whole list is that in his Definitive Edition icon, his hand is detached from his arm. He's not just throwing the axe, but apparently his left hand as well. This continues a trend started in the original Age of Kings model, who also had some undeniable weirdness going on with his hands. Next up, for the turtle ship, this is not the most common unit, especially to see fighting units on land. But one thing you probably never noticed is that turtle ships deal blast damage, very similar to the bombard cannon. Something I had never noticed until just now as well is that turtle ship cannonballs move about twice as fast as bombard cannons for whatever reason. Moving on to the Urumi Swordsmen, something worth noting is that their charge mechanic dealing a huge amount of upfront damage doesn't work on buildings. Wood steel also has no effect on buildings, meaning despite maybe the expectation they're incredible at tearing through them for a few potential reasons, in reality they're actually significantly worse than even generic champions at raising. Next up, for the War Elephant, this is maybe a little similar to the Thirisadai fact, but despite having a larger selection outline than most cavalry, in reality the collision size of the War Elephant is identical to a knight. No wonder you can fit the same number of them on a transport ship, and it also doesn't hurt that they miniaturize themselves as well. Moving on to the War Wagon, a subtle tweak made to that unit I'm guessing a lot of people don't know is that as of 2 years ago, they now have -1 cavalry archer armor. So skirmishers, genitours, and camel archers all deal a sneaky extra 1 damage more than you'd expect and that they took prior. Next, for the Warrior Priest, an implication of this unit being a monk/infantry unit is that they take bonus damage from Eagle Warriors in the light cavalry line. This makes them arguably the only infantry in the game that the Eagle Warrior counters, as just about every infantry unit actually has bonus damage against eagles, along with offensive melee armor. And finally, for the Woad Raider, their battle cry of Kogo is burned into the memories of many players. Kogo! Kogo! In case you're wondering, Kogo literally translates to war, so they're just running around without a shirt, yelling war over and over again. It's amazing anyone will fight them at all. So that concludes the 2-part trivia mini-series covering a fun fact about every unique unit, at least at the castle and dock. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.